Well, thank you.
Oh yeah.
Lovely. Cheers, have a good day.
The tradition pumpkin spice latte once a year. For this video I wanted to mix like a drawing tutorial with a vlog style video. So we're making our way to a pumpkin patch, which is where we go once a year. It's tradition around Halloween. We're gonna get some pumpkins, but I want to get some little ones and draw them from life and do a bit of a drawing tutorial about how to draw from life. And I've been doing a series of these videos on my Patreon already, but I thought I'd do one for YouTube because I'm getting a lot of good feedback from them, so I thought I would bring one to YouTube. Do you like your pumpkin spice latte?
Absolutely love it.
But yeah, I will check in when we're at the pumpkin patch. You ready? Ready to go and find some pumpkins. Gonna get a white one and an orange one. I want a small one. So far so good in terms of the mud, because last time we came it was absolutely like a swamp. This time it's alright.
Yeah, maybe we're early.
It's getting stuck.
You're just not pushing.
I'm too weak. We've chosen one, but it's not perfectly round, so we're still on the hunt for a white one. There's a lot of these that are like green and orange. We found loads of white ones over here, so we're going to make our way there.
Competition's coming.
I've just had a spider on me. Orange and green one.
Which one? This one?
Yeah. That's not bad.
Surprise every time.
Pumpkins are secured and Conrad's just gone to drop the trolley off, so I'm going to take them home, and I think tomorrow I'm going to start the drawing tutorial where I'm going to talk you through step by step how to draw from life. So I'm back from the pumpkin patch. I managed to find some small ones near the exit, and literally look how small they actually are. Tiny. So I picked up a white one, a little orange one, and this tiny little green one. So now that we've got our objects sorted, I'm going to arrange them on my desk and position them in a way that I think would be nice to draw. So I think I'm going to use the Strathmore Bristol vellum paper. This is a really good paper if you're a beginner, because it's so smooth. It doesn't have much grainy texture to it, so it's really easy to blend. So I'm just going to take a piece of paper out of my pad. This is A4 size, and I'm going to secure it to this piece of MDF. I love my desk, but it's got this like slight ridge to it, so I can't draw directly on my desk, so I always draw either on my drawing board or on a piece of MDF because it's completely smooth and it's really sturdy. So I've secured that in place. I've got my pumpkins here at the ready that I'm going to position in a minute, and I've also got my photography softbox tripod light, which is so bright it literally brightens up the whole room even when it's dark. So I've got a really intense light source coming from the right hand side. You can see how it's casting a shadow. So the right hand side of the pumpkins are quite bright, and then we've got this shadow on the left hand side. So no matter where I put them and how I position them, that's going to be the main light source coming from the right hand side. So I've just moved my camera slightly so you can see how I've set up the pumpkins. I've put the two bigger ones behind and I've put the little green one at the front. And I think the fact they're so close together also creates some other shadows in between them where they're kind of connecting. So it should make a really nice drawing. So I'm going to have two different angles showing, an angle above my actual piece of paper that I'm going to be working on, and an angle of the pumpkins from my perspective of me looking at them now, so you can see what I'm looking at. So for this drawing I'm going to use a mixture of the Faber-Castell Pick Graphite matte pencils, which are really high quality graphite pencils. And I'm also going to use, or potentially use, the black polychromo, the ivory black Derwent drawing pencil, which is really, really dark. And I thought I might also incorporate the black pan pastel as well. I think pan pastels are a really soft, quick way to create some shadows and kind of map out where everything is before you get stuck in with more of the detail and kind of tightening things up. So in terms of drawing from life, there's a lot of things to consider and a lot to kind of explain before we get started. First things first, we're basically going to be converting a 3-dimensional object, or in this case 3 pumpkins, 3 objects, into a 2D drawing on paper. And we can still make it look 3D and give it that 3-dimensional illusion, but it's still going to be a flat image. And that's why a lot of artists prefer drawing from photos, myself included, and especially if you're a pet portrait and wildlife artist, because drawing animals from life is a whole different ball game because they don't keep still, for one thing. And sometimes it's nice to have different reference photos to refer to, and you can always go back to them and leave your drawing for a while, come back to it at a later date. Whereas when you're drawing still life, you're kind of drawing exactly what's in front of you, and if you move slightly to the left or slightly to the right, the whole perspective of that object changes. So you, as the artist, actually needs to be quite still when you're looking at the object. So the shapes and the shadows and everything that you can see stays pretty much the same. One other thing to consider when it comes to drawing from life is natural lighting. So I know I mentioned I've got my softbox photography light that's really bright coming from the right hand side. So the right hand side of the pumpkins are quite illuminated, but natural lighting is always changing, like all the time. So it might start off really sunny and it might bring out those warmer colours in the pumpkins or whatever object you decide to draw. And then it might go behind the clouds and then it's projecting all those cooler tones onto the pumpkin. So yeah, natural lighting can change all the time. So that's another thing to factor in. But I think generally, even if you are an artist who likes to work from photos, I think, you know, building up the skill of drawing from life really helps you to see things in a different way. But I think it's a really good skill to have in terms of like how you see things. It completely develops your vision and like how you see things, which is always a good skill to have. Your eyes are a primary way in which we like take in information, and what we see and how we see things is often a lot stronger in terms of the colours and the shadows and the shape, because you're looking at it in real life, the actual objects, they're not a 2D like flat image. So once you're happy with your setup and your point of view, I'm going to go in with one of the Faber-Castell Pitt Graphite matte pencils, if I can actually get into the box. And I think I'll go in with a 6B, so like a nice medium pencil in terms of not being too hard but not being too soft or dark. And in some ways this is kind of the hardest part of drawing from life, mapping out where everything is, visualising everything, making sure you've got the proportions accurate. That's the most difficult part. So what I like to do sometimes, or to make it easier in terms of explaining it, because we've got 3 different objects here, I'm going to do a really fine rough line about halfway and then another one going across, so we've got that nice cross in the centre of our page. And then if you can almost visualise in your mind that same cross in front of the objects that you're drawing and use that as a guide to kind of fill everything in. So I'm going to start with this front pumpkin, this small green one at the front. And I think if you hold your pencil quite far up, you get that sense of movement. And I think it gives you that nice loose, sketchy quality that you can then tighten up later on. So I know that it's obviously a spherical shape, but it's not a perfect circle. Basically making it up of loads of light pressured, sketchy, curved lines that I'm joining together all the way around, kind of altering to make sure I've got the shape sort of accurate. And then you want to kind of add in the stalk in the middle, and it's not perfectly in the middle, it's on like the top half of the pumpkin, and the stalk elongates beyond the pumpkin just a little bit up to about there. So really look at the width of it, look at the length of it. And once you're happy with the lines that you've added in or the shape, you can then just slightly define that line so you know that it's definitely one that you're keeping in. Not worrying about shadows or anything like that yet, just literally mapping out the shape and visualising where they all are in comparison to each other, in relation to each other. So the next one, I'm going to do this larger scale white pumpkin to the left. I'm also looking at the negative space. There's kind of a bit of negative space between the pumpkins here. That's a good shape to get in terms of helping you position them. I know that the bottom edge of this pumpkin is in line with the bottom edge of this stalk. So you're constantly comparing like one little bit to the other. And really don't worry about being messy. This is like the time to be messy, this first initial stage. Look at the width of it as well. It's very wide in comparison to this small pumpkin at the front. And then I'm not really sure on the height, so I'm going to make a start on the pumpkin to the right hand side that's behind this front one. So I can use that as a guide in terms of how high to go with the left one. The bottom edge of this pumpkin is sort of also nearish the bottom of this stalk, as in line with the bottom edge of that stalk. It's quite wide. Constantly glancing at the objects, constantly taking in that information and translating it onto your paper as best you can. And that will come easier with practice. I think the more that you do this, the easier it becomes. When you first draw from life, like what you see definitely doesn't get translated on your paper. I remember doing my first few like life drawing classes when I was at adult college, and I found it really difficult at first, but then by the end of it I absolutely loved it. And it's crazy how, you know, with drawing or with anything, the more that you practice something, the better at it you get. And especially with drawing from life, like it's just training your eyes to see certain things. So I'm also going to add in where this middle stalk is and the shape of that. The tip of the stalk doesn't kind of elongate beyond the pumpkin. So I'm going to do it to around about there. And at the minute, they kind of all, they look like tomatoes at the minute, because I've not done any of the ridges around the pumpkin. I've just wanted to map out the basic shape first. And then I'm going to go back in onto the left pumpkin and just finish off mapping out the proportions and the shape. So the bottom of this stalk is kind of in line with this if we went on a bit of a diagonal. So about there. And the stalk is quite a lot thicker and elongates beyond the pumpkin. But in terms of the shape, it's quite straight. So, yeah, I think I'm pretty happy with the placement of those pumpkins. So that's basically step one, which is kind of the hardest part. And also without all the shading and with all the ribs and the details, it does look quite odd. But yeah, just trust the process, but that is step one. So the next thing, still using this pencil with a light pressure, I'm just going to start adding in the little ridges that make up the pumpkins. So this is where you want to do curved lines and use that stalk as like the center point. So all of your ridges kind of go back into that middle bit. But obviously, depending on your perspective and your point of view in terms of looking at the pumpkins, those curved lines might look a bit straighter than others. They might be going in slightly different directions. But this again is also quite an important part of the piece, because you're in a way kind of showing the structure of the pumpkin and how it's kind of curved and it's a round shape. So it's quite straight and then it goes slightly to the right towards the stalk. And it also, the ridges also get further away from each other the more kind of front facing the pumpkin is, and then they kind of get closer together as it curves back around. I think because we've got these pumpkins all clustered together and they're very close to us, you know, we've got that clarity, we can see all those details quite clearly. But if you kind of focus in on that very front one, that first one that's in the foreground, the smallest one, then the other two pumpkins kind of go in the background. They kind of become part of your peripheral vision, so they're not as detailed. But because we're focusing on sort of one at a time, we'll be focusing in on all of the details for each individual object, so it won't look like anything's out of focus or not in our perfect line of vision. This front one doesn't really have any ridges. It's got little markings on it, but they're not exactly ridges. Like, it doesn't go in and then out like a bumpy sort of texture. It's just completely smooth, but it's got these lighter green markings all the way around. So I'm just going to map out where they are. Even with these, look at the space between them. I've kind of started with that centre line because I know it kind of comes directly down from the stalk, and then I've drawn the rest in according to that one. And then I'm going to draw the ridges on the final pumpkin. It seems to be quite flat on top, and then it sticks out, it's quite wide at the sides. So when you're drawing these, bear that in mind. It's kind of flat on top, and then you want that curved line as you get down to about halfway to give that illusion. And also look at where it kind of sticks out as well. Kind of dints back in and then sticks out again. So that's our sort of basic outline. So we now want to start adding in all of that shadow, building up more of that tonal value and contrast to make these objects look three-dimensional. So I think I'm going to start with the black pan pastel. I'm obviously a coloured pencil artist, but I do incorporate quite a few pan pastels in my tutorials, my commissions and my original work. If I'm ever doing a background that's really subtle, I'll tend to use pan pastels, or I'll tend to use them as a base layer because it's just a quick way to kind of block in that colour. Obviously for these pumpkins I'm going to be sticking to the monotone, just black and white, building up shadow. And you want to go in with a soft knife, which is like an applicator for the pan pastel, which basically has a sponge on the end of it, so it's easier to apply the pan pastel where you want it to go. I always get the oval shaped ones because I feel like they're a nice shape to kind of stay within the lines, but also you can use the whole flat side to kind of spread it around a little bit as well. So you want to start by applying this black pan pastel on the back of your sponge. Also apply it to like the edges as well, and then you want to just tap off any excess. So you've got this on the back of your sponge now, and I always like to apply it first where it's darkest. So I think I'm going to start with this front pumpkin because this is the darkest pumpkin with it being dark green, and just apply that pigment. So the darkest or the most concentrated bit of pan pastel gets applied in those darkest areas, and then you can kind of spread it around from there. And a little bit does go a long way, and it's so easily spreadable and blendable. Sounds like I'm talking about butter. Easily spreadable. I'm kind of following it along the little lines that we did, those lighter little markings or colours within the like outer layer of the pumpkin. And remember that the left hand side of each of the pumpkins is a lot darker because the light is coming directly from the right hand side. And look at where it's kind of a little bit shiny on the pumpkin as well. Around the top here, we've kind of got a bit of a shine to it. I'm going to now focus on the next pumpkin and reapply the pan pastel. I'm going to start by applying it to the stalk because that's the darkest part. Also fill in the front one stalk as well. And then just kind of spread that around and work into each section of the pumpkin, really kind of differentiating those light and dark areas in between the little ribs or dints within the pumpkin. A lot of people ask me if I use fixative when using pan pastels on paper, and the answer is no. I mean, you can do, but I don't tend to. Whenever I'm using pan pastels, I'll always tend to add, you know, quite a few layers of coloured pencil over the top, so it kind of locks it into the paper that way. But because we'll be using graphite, I guess that's going to kind of do the same thing, but you might want to add a bit of fixative. But I think it should be alright, to be honest, once we've added in our graphite over the top and black coloured pencils. So you can see how quick this is in terms of the process. It really helps to speed things up. And with coloured pencils, not that we're using loads of colour pencils in this tutorial, but generally I find that pan pastels do speed up the process when it comes to colour pencils. To get to this point just by using coloured pencils would take ages, and Yeah, any way or any method or technique that you can find that speeds up the process a little bit when it comes to coloured pencils, then you want to kind of stick with that, because they are a very time consuming medium. Just add a little bit more pan pastel around the base of that stalk. Then I'm going to add a little bit into the white pumpkin. Obviously this is a lot paler, so I'm just going to add a little bit and try not to reapply. I'm going to start by applying it into the stalk to get rid of the excess pigment, and then kind of spread around the rest of it from there. I'm leaving the bits that are really bright white and that are being directly hit by the light as they are. You can see the gaps that I'm leaving. I'm just focusing on those rigid little bits and the shadows, just to give a bit more structure to the pumpkin. This is where you can use the side of your soft knife applicator as well. So that's added a really nice bit of soft yet subtle shadow to each of our pumpkins. So they're starting to look a bit more three-dimensional now. We've definitely given them that structure. One thing that pan pastels are really good for is creating a little shadow underneath, because we can get that really soft kind of fade off into the paper. It should work really well. I'm just going to stick with what's already on my sponge, and I'm going to apply this just underneath each of the pumpkins, kind of where it makes a connection with the table that it's sort of sitting on. And then you want to kind of spread it out from there. But look at the shape of the shadow as well, because it's kind of reflecting the shape of that object onto the table. Just using the side of my sponge to get a bit of a darker colour going on, directly underneath this left pumpkin. And then spread it out. Apply a bit more where it's darkest, and then spread that out again, just to intensify that shadow slightly. So I'm going to leave it like that, I think, for the shadow for now. We can always intensify that a little bit later on. But yeah, I've kind of mapped out the shape of the shadow, brought it down and spread it out slightly. So I'm going to leave that there for now with the pan pastel. At this point, I'm going to go back in with the Pick Graphite Matte Faber-Castell pencil and just start to kind of define some of these ridges and some of the outlines. Just give it a bit more definition. So we're kind of tightening up the shapes and darkening the shadowy parts. I'm still using the 6B pencil. You want to kind of tighten up that bottom edge. Want to add a bit more definition to each of the stalks as well, so sharpen up the shape. and start bringing in some of that rigid detail. It kind of looks like tree bark in terms of the texture, like very rigid and rough. This front one kind of twists its way up. I think when you're shading and building up like your tonal value, you definitely don't want to be doing like linear motions like this. It's better if you do small circular motions and build up that shadow gradually. I think if you do linear motions when you're shading, it kind of makes the object look flat. It doesn't have that same kind of three-dimensional quality to it. So I'm starting off by shading along the bottom of this front pumpkin. So I'm kind of leaving out the lighter little stripes going along the outer part of the pumpkin without making it look like it's kind of going in or raised up like those ridges. We want it to still look flat. You want to add a bit of shadow around the base of the stalk. And then I'm going to move on to the pumpkin on the right. So I've already added a bit of shading into the stalk there. This pumpkin isn't as dark as the front one. So I'm just mainly going to focus on these ridges where it's a little bit darker and just tighten up that line and add a bit of definition in those areas, darkening the shadow. I think you want to make the shadow slightly more intense directly behind this front pumpkin because it's casting a shadow back onto the pumpkin behind. So to make them look quite close together, you just want to intensify that shadow in this area slightly. Just by adding another few layers or by slightly increasing your pressure when you're shading. So I'm also going to add a little bit of shading into this white pumpkin, but obviously not as much because it is very pale. I'm going to start with the stalk. And I keep kind of switching between the flat side of my pencil when I'm shading to get that soft line, and the pointier part of my pencil for when I'm sort of defining these lines and making them a bit sharper, sort of around the stalk and any other little bits of detail where you might want a finer line. But yeah, the stalk's kind of just made up of loads of little lines that are kind of all close together to make it look quite rigid. And then I'm going to very lightly work into some of these ridges to add a bit more definition to them. Increase that contrast slightly. I'm just letting my pencil kind of brush across the surface. So I'm in kind of constant control and I'm not going to risk adding too much. I think I might also just add in these little speckled kind of imperfections on the surface of the pumpkin. They're quite obvious on this left pumpkin, obviously, because it's white, so they show up a bit more. Yeah, I'm just going to do some random little dots kind of where they are. A little bit on the top. This pumpkin's also got a few little imperfections on the surface. And then I think I'm also just going to add a little bit more of a shadow underneath the pumpkins whilst I've got this pencil still in my hand. Just to kind of intensify that contrast a little bit more. You just want to do sort of back and forth motions going in the same direction. Just letting your pencil brush across the surface, keeping it really controlled so it kind of fades off nicely and gradually. And then I'm going to bring it round the front. This little bit here, this like negative space, is quite bright, so I'm going to leave that as it is. I think the shadows are mainly towards the front. The light's kind of coming from the right hand side and the back of the pumpkins, so that's why it's casting the shadow more towards the front. So I think I'm going to leave that there for now with the Pick Graphite matte pencil. Next up, I'm going to go in with the black polychromo, and this is obviously going to be a lot darker than what we've used so far, so you want to kind of define those darkest edges, add in or intensify those shadows, and add a bit of darker detail to the surface of the pumpkin, but especially the stalks. Just going along those main ridges, making them look a little bit deeper. Might also want to intensify the shadow underneath the pumpkins, kind of directly where it meets the table, to give it that contrast. So you want to add a few little squiggles and dots as well to the stalk, because it's not just made up of lines. There's any little marks that you can add in to create that rigid sort of rough texture is all good. And then the same to the bigger pumpkin. You could also go in with the ivory black Derwent drawing pencil, which is a lot more pigmented than the black polychromo, like a lot more. So just for those darkest areas, you want to add a little bit of this. It's very soft, this pencil. It's kind of very waxy, really soft. So it's good for blending and stuff like that if you're doing a bigger drawing, but it's really good for just, you know, intensifying the darkest bits of a portrait or a drawing like this, to really kind of increase that contrast and make some of those areas look really intense. Just added a little bit into this front pumpkin, and I've added a little bit into each of the stalks as well. At this point I'm going to go back in with the black pan pastel and just add a little bit onto the back of my sponge, and I'm just going to go over this front pumpkin. This will start to kind of soften out some of that grainy texture that the graphite's picked up from the texture of the paper. And you also want to add it to the shadow underneath. If you feel like you've got too much on, you can always just use like a scrap piece of paper to kind of get rid of any excess, and then go back in with that and spread around what's on your paper. So just to finish off this front pumpkin, I think I'm happy with how the back two are looking. Obviously this left one is quite pale anyway, so I don't really want to add any more shade into that. You could just use the your sponge and the pan pastel, what's left on your sponge, just to go over some of that grainy part of the shading, just to get rid of that grainy texture over the top of that graphite. And then for this front pumpkin, this is what I'm going to focus on. There's two different rubbers that you can use. So I've got the Ultra Fine Mono Zero Elastoma Eraser. This is 2.3mm, and it's basically got a tiny little rubber on the end, and you can hold it like a pen or a pencil. So you've got maximum control, and it just lifts off that pigment quite easily off the paper. I've also got this Derwent battery powered eraser, which has got a little button on the side. You put 2 batteries in it, and it kind of spins around really fast. So if you're wanting a more intense highlight, you can get some really nice effects with this. But I'll show you first the Tombow eraser. So what you want to do is just work into the lightest parts of the pumpkin. I'm just going down where those lighter little markings are on the surface, and you'll find that that pigment should lift off quite easily. So if you did want to make it a little bit more intense, then if you do have one of these Derwent battery powered erasers, then you can literally just create some little dots and markings within the pumpkin. The thing is with this, as soon as it touches the surface of the paper, it lifts that pigment off straight away because it's rotating that fast that it just lifts off. So in some ways, for like little intricate details, it's not the best because you can't control it as much as you can with the Tombow eraser, but you can create some more intense highlights, as you can see here. So I'm just going to kind of soften them by going back over it with the Tombow eraser. And you can always add little bits of highlight throughout this other pumpkin as well, on the right hand side. Add some little bumps and whatnot to the surface to make it look more natural and realistic. And also use it to kind of brighten any of the ridges so it really looks like they're being hit by the light. And then you can always go back in with the Pitt Graphite Matte Faber-Castell Pencil 6B, just to go over some of these highlights if you want to kind of bring it back again and make them a bit darker. Might just go back in with the Tombow eraser along the top here, just to create that little bit of shine. But yeah, I think I'm going to leave that there for this tutorial. So I hope you've enjoyed this different style of video. Definitely let me know what you thought and if you'd like me to do some of these similar kind of videos. And hopefully you can take away a few top tips in terms of how you can draw from life. But like I said, it does take a lot of practice, and the more that you do, the easier you'll kind of see things. So yeah, definitely practice. I also did this before. Before I started this tutorial, or this part of this video, I filmed this, which is this white pumpkin here, which is actually a video that I'm going to put on Patreon. So if you're interested in learning how to draw from life with coloured pencils and incorporating colour into the drawing, then go and check out that video on my Patreon, where you've got access to over 3 years worth of tutorials as well. So yeah, a very pumpkin drawing morning I've done there. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, give it a thumbs up, and please subscribe to my channel to see more art related content and future videos like this. I've actually attached the full materials list in the video description below, and thank you so much for watching.